Trigger warning. This story includes references to sexual abuse and self-harm. If you are triggered by these topics, please pause now. Help resources and hotlines are linked in the description below. She carried it in the skin of her forearm. A pale, ragged line that looked like a map of a place she'd never wanted to revisit. When Ashley pulled down the sleeve of her sweatshirt, the scar seemed to settle into the room like an accusation. On buses, in classrooms, at the dinner table. People saw the mark and then looked away. Or worse, they asked the wrong kind of question and treated her like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be trusted. She moved through her days as if she were an understudy in her own life, present enough to not be noticed, careful enough not to make a scene. At school, she sat on the edge of the art room table, knees tucked under a paint-splattered sweatshirt, sketchbook closed, pencils damp between her fingers. The group therapy session on Thursdays folded around her like a thick, polite fog. Adults took notes. Other kids tried to be brave in the ways they'd learned on the internet, saying the words that were expected, and then looking at their phones. Ashley answered in fragments when asked, head bowed, voice small. Sometimes she let a line slip. I'm fine. Or, I don't want to talk about it. And that was the end of the conversation. At home, the air was thinner. Her mother, Mrs. Collins, worked nights at a restaurant and came home with a kind of tiredness that wore impatience like armor. Most evenings their dinner was a ritual of terse sentences and clattering plates. Mrs. Collins could be sharp in a way that disguised fear. She argued with the world and with a grief that had calcified into a hard center. When a school counselor called to ask questions, the phone staccatoed across the kitchen table. Sometimes Mrs. Collins listened. Sometimes she denied. Sometimes she accused the school of overreaching. Ashley learned to keep the house in miniature. Small movements, softer words, fewer questions. There were other marks besides the one on her arm. The past had written itself into the way she folded her hands, into the way she flinched when someone raised their voice, into the habit of visiting her social feeds like someone checking closed windows. Online, the world was both threat and refuge. Chat rooms were bright with invisible hands. Some reached in helpful ways, some reached with knives. She had learned the rules the hard way. Do not give away personal details. Do not meet strangers alone. Do not tell things that cut too close. Those rules kept her safe and kept her small. Then, late one blue-tinged night, when sleep felt like an act of trust she couldn't afford, she went to a place she had gone before out of habit and loneliness. An art forum that also had a chat thread where people sent pictures of sketchbooks, of sketchy sunrises, of coffee rings on napkins. She uploaded one of her drawings, a quick charcoal face, eyes smudged like rain. A username she didn't expect wrote back. Candies. Candies was a person with no demand, only attention. That attention arrived as small things at first. She noticed the charcoal strokes and asked about the paper. She complimented the way Ashley shaded cheeks. She didn't push for explanations. She sent a message that said, "Your lines hold breath," and then she logged off. Those few words felt unfamiliar and safe, like someone naming a place you'd been hiding in and not mocking it. Their conversations grew without fanfare. They spoke about materials and movies and silly little routines, the exact way to make lemon soda fizz over crushed ice, the right angle for light on a canvas. Candies shared photos of a messy apartment bookshelf and a mug with a crack mended by glue. She asked how Ashley slept, and then waited for an answer. She asked if she could see more of the sketchbook. Ashley replied with a scan of pages, each one a private prayer in graphite. When Ashley hesitated, Candies would say something soft and unassuming, never urgent. Only if you want to. There were moments, small ones, that made Ashley's muscles unclench without her permission. A joke that landed, a quiet hour texting about nothing important, a photo of a lemon tree in bloom. Candy's messages arrived like little offerings, a playlist for rainy days, a picture of someone holding a jacket in a laundromat that had a patch on the elbow. Once, after a week of messages that had moved from the general to the specific, Candice asked if Ashley would like a jacket. "I have one," she wrote. "It looks ridiculous on me, but it keeps people warm. I can leave it at the coffee shop on Maple if you want." Ashley paused for a long minute. The rules she had learned were like armor. Never take physical gifts from people online. Never invite strangers into your life. But warmth is a currency, and some nights she felt so cold she could see the breath of it. She wrote back, cautious and curious. "Why would you do that?" "Because sometimes things are heavy, and jackets make them easier to carry," Candice replied. The meeting was deliberately unromantic. Candice handed the jacket across a small table in the corner of the coffee shop, the fabric smelling faintly of detergent and lemon. She watched Ashley with a look that had neither pity nor hunger, only a steady, unblinking attention that felt like a hand placed on the small of her back to steady her on a steep step. "Try it on," she said softly. Ashley did, and the jacket fit like a promise that wasn't loud. It was large on her shoulders and smelled like someone else's morning. She moved differently in it. The weight settled in a way that made the world seem a fraction less sharp. That jacket became one of the first trust gestures of their relationship, small and practical and entirely non-invasive. It also became a marker. The day Ashley left the coffee shop wearing it. The day she let an intentional act of kindness cross the line between screens and real skin. She kept the jacket at school on particularly hard days, draped over chairbacks, a presence she could reach for when the world seemed too cold. Not everything outside Candy's messages was gentle. Bullies learned their lines in the bodies of other teenagers. There were whispers about Ashley in the hallways, about the mark on her arm, or the way she slipped out of conversations when they turned too intimate. Some classmates tried to be kind and failed. Others offered curiosity that felt invasive. A girl named Carly asked questions in a way that sounded like gossip, and then posted a note in a group chat that made Ashley's stomach drop. In class, someone would tap their pencil and make a snide comment, and the world would shrink to the size of a thumb pressed against the edge of a page. Therapy was another strange stage. The school counselor, with her warm cardigan and clipboard, spoke in careful tones. The social worker offered pamphlets and checkboxes, and asked for details Ashley had learned to compress into tidy, unspeaking versions of herself. Those adults were not villains. They were people trained to catalog pain. To Ashley, they felt procedural, attempts at repair that didn't reach the parts that hurt because those parts had names she couldn't say. She resented their intrusion and at times felt exposed by their concern. It was easier often to decline or to nod and keep to that practiced smallness. On a wet afternoon, when the sky had the color of old photographs, something broke open. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a fissure formed by accumulation. A fight with her mother over a notice slipped on the kitchen table. A social worker calling to arrange a home visit. A classmate's whisper that escaped into a rumor. Those little pressures gathered at once, and Ashley found herself alone in the back bedroom. The light a thin slice across the floor, the jacket hanging heavy on the chair. She curled on her bed and realized she couldn't keep the parts separated anymore. The quiet in school, the cold at home, the silence in the therapy room. Her throat felt raw with words that would not form. That evening, the collision of anger and fear and exhaustion pushed her to send something she hadn't planned to send, a message whose edges were brittle. "He hurt me," she typed, fingers trembling. "Someone I trusted hurt me." The sentence sat between her and the glowing screen like a glass. Her palms were slick. She almost deleted it, then didn't. She hit send. Candy's reply came fast, like a hand reaching across a puddle. "I'm here," she wrote. "Do you want me to come by? We can sit. No talk if you don't want. Just sit." Ashley looked at the jacket, then at the profile picture of the woman who had been patient for months online. It was an impossible decision, one of those that feels like choosing between two bad options. For once, something in her wanted to take the seat at the table of someone else's life. She wrote back, "Okay." Candies arrived quietly, carrying a thermos of something that smelled like lemon and sugar. She didn't ask the usual prying questions. She placed the thermos on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed, the way someone sits when they don't want to crowd, but also don't plan to leave. She asked nothing, and somehow that lack of demand felt enormous. When Ashley started to speak, the words came out jagged and small. She didn't describe the abuse. She said, "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could keep it inside. But I can't anymore." Candies listened. She believed. She said simply, "I'm so sorry that happened to you. I'm here with you." There was no ribald curiosity, no attempt to fill the silence with platitudes. There was only the steadying presence of someone who refused to look away. That refusal to look away was an education of its own. Candies modeled ways of being with someone who had been broken without turning the breaking into spectacle. When Ashley began to flinch at sudden noises, Candies asked, "Would you like me to turn that down?" She accompanied Ashley to a school appointment, not to interrogate or to take over, but to show witness and to make the strange halls of institutional help feel less alien. At the office, she sat in the waiting room with her hands clasped, a quiet presence that didn't require explanation. Later, when Ashley's social worker suggested a therapy referral, Candice said, "If you want, I can come with you." That offer, accompanying her to therapy, was the second of the essential trust gestures that marked their slow arc. Therapy itself was everything and nothing. The first session felt like walking into a room full of language where the words were all heavier than the things they were meant to name. The therapist asked whether Ashley felt safe and what she wanted from therapy. Ashley answered in small, blunt sentences. Sometimes sessions were simply a place to sit while someone else helped hold the pieces. Sometimes they were more. Recovery, as the therapist said in neutral tones, was not a destination, but a series of small entrances. The work was boring and revolutionary at once. Journaling, naming sensations in the body, learning to ask for boundaries explicitly, practicing saying no without the voice of guilt amplifying the words. Outside the appointment, Candice kept showing up in uncomplicated ways. She left soup on the kitchen counter when Ashley came home late, a bowl covered with cling film and a note, "Eat." She sat with her on a bench by the river and watched the gulls argue over fries, not because she had nothing to say, but because being quiet together was sometimes the most radical thing they could do. Candice taught consent like a craft. She never moved closer without asking. She always checked in before touching a shoulder or offering a hand. When Ashley winced at the brush of a sleeve against a scar, Candice paused and said, "Is this okay?" It was tedious and radical in equal measure, the insistence on agency that made Ashley's body too important to be assumed. In time, Ashley began to make small decisions she had avoided. She started painting again. The first time she set up an easel after months of avoidance, her hands shook so much she couldn't hold the brush. Candice took her to a thrift store and bought canvases with absurd patterns on the backs. They filled the apartment with ordinary things. Mismatched mugs, a second-hand lamp that made a circle of light, a plant that stubbornly refused to die. Ashley learned the ritual of mixing pigments, the way ultramarine drank in light, the way cadmium cut through gray. The act of coloring a blank surface felt like a reclamation. It was not that the past disappeared, but it had diminished enough to permit an intervention. The paint was a medium for an interior life that could be reshaped in small movements. Not everyone approved. Mrs. Collins watched these changes with suspicion. Some nights she picked fights. Other times she sat like a shadow in the doorway, silence heavy with something that could have been fear or pride or the bitter aftertaste of survival. The home visits increased. A social worker came with notebook and pen and asked whether the household felt stable. Ashley answered as best she could. She started to understand that telling the truth did not always lead to grand rescue. Sometimes it led to practical help. Sometimes it led to strained family meetings. Sometimes it just made the house louder for a while. One night, when the house erupted in an argument, Ashley stood in the doorway and felt something in her crack, open and spill forward. A confession that was less about seeking vengeance and more about being named. She said the words aloud that had previously lived in a pit of silence. "He hurt me," she said. "I don't want him in my life." The sentence landed like a stone in a pond. Mrs. Collins's face changed. For the first time, something like grief slipped past her anger. She didn't know how to say "I'm sorry" in the right way. Instead, she said, "Why didn't you say anything before?" It was an honest question asked badly. The confrontation that followed was messy and human. There was crying and a phone call and a social worker's careful voice. There were no cinematic revelations, no neat closures. There was only a scattering of facts and the building of a support map. People, appointments, options, boundaries. The turning point was not procedural. It was relational. Candice sat with Ashley on the bed when the house was noisy and when it was quiet. She offered a steady presence. She held no judgments. She did not pressure Ashley to press charges or to fix what could not be fixed. Instead, she taught what survivors often need to be taught first: that their pain was real, that their responses were human, and that they did not have to be defined only by what happened to them. Time is a curious teacher. It softens some edges and sharpens others. Over the months that followed, the pattern between Ashley and Candice found a rhythm. They developed rituals: grocery runs on Saturdays, sketching together on rainy afternoons, a Sunday evening where they watched the same low-budget romantic movies and critiqued the acting. Candice's presence was reliable in ways that were foreign to Ashley's past. The act of being remembered, texts that asked, "How are you today?" became a steady drumbeat that taught Ashley new rules. People could be kind without strings, affection could be offered and refused without catastrophe, and love could be an action rather than a demand. Slowly, even the way Ashley looked at herself shifted. The sign on the bathroom mirror that read "Be kind" felt like a dare she could accept. She began to patch her sleeve when it had holes, to style her hair with careless fingers, to paint portraits that looked like people who had lived through things and kept going. Her art, once compressed into margins of notebooks, grew bolder. She painted a series of canvases that were all about hands, open palms and folded fingers, and the way a hand can be a shelter. In one piece, she painted a jacket draped over the back of a chair, the color of sagging hope, but rendered with care. Art allowed her to say what her mouth could not yet form. Then, a soft but undeniable shift occurred. The relationship that had been mentorship, that had grown out of absence and careful tending, moved into a territory that neither of them announced with fanfare, nor tried to label in the immediate moment. It happened in textures: the way Candice's laugh spread over the kitchen table, the way Ashley reached for the hem of the jacket without thinking, the way their silences stopped feeling like gaps to be bridged, and felt instead like rooms where they both could breathe. These small changes were not sudden. They were accumulations that laid down a new grammar, the vocabulary of mutual care. But there was an ethical seam to cross. Ashley was 17 when Candice first arrived in her life. The rules of safety and ethics were clear and necessary. Candice's role was to be a steady companion, not to step into an eroticized adult-minor relationship. For months and months, their intimacy was intentional but non-sexual. Candice modeled boundaries that protected both of them. She always asked before touching Ashley's arm. She never stayed past curfew without consent, and she kept the focus on support rather than possession. They navigated the legal and moral contours with care because care itself requires restraint. Time, however, is not static. The years stretched. Ashley turned 18, then 19. The jacket, which had once been a warm talisman for cold nights, began to carry a different weight. It was years later, after the slow work of therapy and the building of a life that included part-time college courses and an art collective, that the dynamic between them altered into something more openly romantic. It did not burst into being. It arrived like late light in autumn, gradual, undeniable, and tinted with the patience that had grown in the intervening seasons. When the shift finally happened, it was neither dramatic nor manufactured. They had been volunteering at an LGBTQ+ art workshop one Saturday, arranging canvases and teaching teenagers how to let color decide their lines. Afterwards, they walked to the river with 2 coffees, the city settling into the hush of evening. Ashley, now older, had learned to trust herself enough to cross the street without checking the curb twice. She laughed at something Candace said, a laugh that wasn't rehearsed. In a moment of quiet, Candace reached for her hand. She did not take it without asking. She checked with a small, "Is this okay?" The question was the echo of years of consent. Ashley answered with a smile and turned her hand to meet Candy's palm. That handhold was a confirmation of something they'd both known for a while. Affection had been growing quietly under the surface, watered by patience and mutual care. The moment was ordinary, 2 hands clasped, the river thrumming beside them, and profound because it was chosen freely by both. They walked a little closer, shoulder to shoulder, and when Candace leaned and kissed Ashley's forehead, it was a benediction rather than a claim. Ashley leaned into it. The kiss lacked glamour. It was an intimate punctuation that said, "You are not alone." Even here, there were no fireworks and no cinematic declarations. Love had been taught to her in small units: the jacket, the soups, the accompanying to therapy, the holding of hands with permission. These actions formed a curriculum on how to accept love that did not devour, but instead preserved her agency. It was not that the past had been erased. The scar on Ashley's arm remained, a pale river in the skin, but there were new traces overlaying it: the faint outline of a brush stroke here, a fingernail paint smudge there, a note tucked into the pocket of the jacket that read, in Candy's handwriting, "Here, if you need to leave." The years that followed were not a sequence of miraculous cures. There were relapses into old fears, days when the weight of memory pressed down and painted the world gray. There were nights when panic returned like a gust of winter wind, but there were also days when she sat at her easel for hours and didn't notice the time, when her mother learned how to say, "I'm listening," in a way that didn't contain blame, when she found a community of artists who welcomed her work without relegating it to the category of trauma art. Candace taught her to name what she needed. Ashley learned to ask for it, and to refuse demands that felt like invasion. They built a shared life that had margins and boundaries, friends and solitary spaces, messy disagreements and careful reconciliations. One afternoon, some years after the jacket first crossed a coffee table, Ashley sat at the seaside bench with a new canvas propped beside her. The light slanted in slashes of honey. Gulls circled like punctuation in the sky. Candace handed her a lemon soda in a glass bottle, and the fizz drew a small laugh out of Ashley. "Do you remember when you first told me you liked lemon soda?" Candace asked. Ashley smiled, thumb tracing the worn seam of the jacket folded over her knees. "You told me it would make me braver." "I lied," Candace said, grinning. "It just makes things taste better." They sat in companionable silence for a while, 2 people who had shown up for each other over years of ordinary gestures. Ashley picked up her brush and painted a hand. 2 hands, actually, with the jacket draped over the back of a chair nearby. It was not a grand allegory. It was a clear, tender picture of how small acts could accumulate into a way of living. At night, when storms rolled off the water and the house hummed, they would sometimes sit and read aloud from the same book, trading paragraphs back and forth like a private radio show. On harder nights when Ashley's mind intruded with the past, Candace would sit and listen, and then offer practical things: a cup of tea warmed just so, a jacket left on the back of a chair, the offer to accompany her to a therapy session. The gestures were simple but exacting steps on a long stairway. they became the grammar of how Ashley learned to accept affection without losing herself. The story that begins with a scar does not end with a tidy moral. There is no scene where all pain evaporates and everything looks perfect. Instead, there are sequences of repair. A social worker who taught Ashley to navigate support. A therapist who helped her vocabulary for boundaries. A community that recognized her as an artist, not just as a survivor. And a woman who offered consistent, consenting love. Those elements wove together into a life that allowed some breathing room she hadn't known was possible. In the end, the most profound lesson wasn't that she stopped being broken. It was that being broken did not disqualify her from being loved. She learned that love could be a practice learned in the small acts. A jacket left without expectation. A hand asked for and accepted. A person who shows up to a clinic and waits in the lobby with no script. She learned to give that same careful attention back, to herself, to her friends, and to the possibility of tenderness. On a bright morning, she pinned a new canvas on the wall of her small studio. It was a portrait of a woman with paint on her fingers, holding a jacket in one hand and a bottle of lemon soda in the other. The eyes were steady. The scar on the forearm was there in the painting, pale but present, and the expression was not one of defeat, but of guarded contentment. Beside the painting, in a small, crooked frame, a message from Candice read, "I'm here." She had been taught to love again, not because the past had vanished, but because she had been shown, patiently, persistently, what safety looked like in practice. She had been given permission to take up space, to ask for boundaries, to accept kindness without explaining it away. Candice had been the unexpected woman who noticed a closed sketchbook and kept asking until the cover cracked open. If this story has touched something in you, if any part of it resonates, please remember you are not alone. Resources are listed in the description below for support with abuse and self-harm. If you are in immediate danger, contact your local emergency services. If Ashley's story mattered to you, subscribe for more survivor stories and WLW narratives. There are more voices to hear, and there is strength in listening.